The drawing room at Windermere House had surrendered its customary dignity to the peculiar chaos of amateur theatricals. Where usually only the soft rustle of turning pages and the gentle clink of china marked the evening hours, now there was a different quality to the air, something expectant and slightly fevered, as if the very walls had absorbed the nervous energy of players preparing to assume roles rather grander than their daily selves might warrant. Lady Constance Windermere stood beside the marble mantelpiece, her silver hair arranged with the precision that had marked her presentation at court some 40 years past. At 62, she retained the bearing of a woman accustomed to command, though time had refined her beauty into something more formidable than merely attractive. The afternoon light, filtered through tall windows overlooking the Kentish countryside, caught the careful arrangement of chairs she had positioned in a theatrical semicircle, their burgundy velvet seeming to absorb both light and sound with equal discretion. "I do think we might begin," she announced, her voice carrying the particular authority of one who had spent decades organising charitable committees and managing households with equal efficiency. Upon a small table beside her lay several leather-bound scripts, each marked with annotations in her precise handwriting, and beside them a stack of scarlet cards bearing the Windermere crest, invitations to the supper that would follow their performance for the children's shelter. The assembled company stirred with that restlessness, peculiar to people who are not entirely comfortable with one another, but are bound by social obligation to maintain the pretence otherwise. Mrs. Vivian Ashcroft, whose theatrical ambitions had never quite matched her social ones, adjusted her silk scarf with unnecessary precision. She had arrived precisely 15 minutes late, which she considered the appropriate interval to suggest importance, without causing genuine offence, a calculation that spoke volumes about both her character and her circumstances. "Naturally, Constance," Mrs. Ashcroft replied, her tone suggesting that beginning had always been her own intention. "Though I must say, the lighting in here is rather challenging for those of us playing the younger roles." A barely perceptible silence followed this observation. Mrs. Ashcroft was 58, and her casting as Queen Gertrude had been a delicate negotiation, involving both her generous subscription to the charity and Lady Constance's diplomatic skills. Mr. Geoffrey Harrington cleared his throat with the deliberate sound of a man preparing to assert himself. As the only gentleman present who had actually trodden professional boards, albeit briefly, and some 30 years past, he felt entitled to certain considerations. His Hamlet, while perhaps lacking the fire of youth, possessed what he considered the authority of experience. "Perhaps we might discuss the blocking for the soliloquy before we proceed. I've had some thoughts about the positioning." "How thoughtful of you, Geoffrey," said Miss Diana Thornfield from her position near the window, where the failing light seemed to gather about her like a benediction. At 26, she was genuinely young enough to play Ophelia without irony, a fact that seemed to cause her more discomfort than pleasure. There was something in her voice, a quality of careful neutrality, that suggested depths beneath the surface of her politeness. She had been staying at Windermere for 3 weeks now, ostensibly to help with the production, but more truthfully because she had nowhere else to go. Her circumstances, while not discussed openly, were understood by all present to be somewhat reduced. The final member of their company sat slightly apart from the others, as befitted his station. Mr. Pembroke, Lady Constance's secretary, was a thin, precise man of indeterminate middle age who managed his employer's correspondence and increasingly her theatrical enthusiasms. His notebook lay open upon his knee, ready to record not only the practical details of their rehearsals, but also, with careful discretion, the various tensions that seemed to multiply with each gathering. The room itself seemed to hold its breath as Lady Constance moved to the centre of their circle with measured grace. The scent of aged leather mingled with beeswax polish and the faint sweetness of hothouse flowers, creating an atmosphere thick with expectation. "I believe we should begin with the scene between Gertrude and Hamlet. Vivian, if you would." Mrs. Ashcroft rose with what she clearly intended as queenly dignity, though the effect was somewhat compromised by her need to consult her script immediately. "Of course, though I do hope we might discuss my interpretation of Gertrude's motivations. I've been reading rather extensively about the psychological aspects of the role." "How fascinating," murmured Mr. Harrington, in a tone that suggested precisely the opposite. Miss Thornfield moved to the makeshift performance area with unconscious grace that seemed to transform the familiar drawing room into something approaching an actual stage. When she spoke Ophelia's lines, even in rehearsal, the words carried a weight of genuine feeling that made the others seem merely to be reciting. "There's rosemary, that's for remembrance. Pray, love, remember," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet somehow filling the room completely. The effect was rather spoiled by Mrs. Ashcroft's response, delivered with theatrical emphasis that belonged more properly to a music hall than to Shakespeare. Mr. Pembroke made a small notation in his book, while Lady Constance's expression remained carefully neutral, though those who knew her well might have detected a slight tightening around her eyes. As the afternoon wore on and the light began to fade, the careful politeness that had marked the beginning of their gathering showed signs of strain. Each member of the company carried within them some private dissatisfaction, some hidden resentment or thwarted ambition that the artificial intimacy of theatrical collaboration seemed to magnify rather than resolve. The elegant surface of their gathering was beginning to show hairline cracks, not with any sudden fracture, but with the quiet, inexorable spread of fine lines appearing on porcelain subjected to too much pressure. When Lady Constance finally called for tea as the clock struck 6, the players relaxed into their ordinary selves with visible relief, like actors removing uncomfortable costumes. None of them could have imagined that within 24 hours one of their number would be dead, and their little drama would be overshadowed by a far more serious performance, one in which Inspector Roderick Alleyn would play the leading role, and where the final curtain would fall on something far more permanent than make-believe. The morning light at Windermere House filtered through tall windows with the discretion of a well-trained servant, illuminating without intruding. Mr. Pembroke, whose internal clock had been calibrated by 30 years of faithful service, descended the main staircase at precisely 7:15, his leather portfolio tucked beneath his arm and his mind already organising the day's correspondence. The house retained that particular quality of early morning silence that spoke of a household still wrapped in the gentle amnesia of sleep. His route to the small study where he conducted the morning's business took him past the morning room where Lady Constance often received her more intimate callers. The door, which should have been firmly closed, stood slightly ajar, a detail that caused Mr. Pembroke to pause with the instinctive unease of one whose world depended upon the maintenance of proper order. Through the narrow opening he caught sight of a figure seated in the Queen Anne chair beside the fireplace, and his first assumption was that Lady Constance had risen even earlier than usual. But something in the absolute stillness of the posture, a quality of repose that seemed too complete for mere early morning contemplation, drew him to push the door open wider. Mrs. Vivian Ashcroft sat with her head tilted slightly against the chair's high back, her morning dress arranged with a precision that might have been artistic were it not for the unnatural pallor that had settled upon her features like frost on marble. Her hands rested in her lap with the composed finality of a portrait, and beside her on the small occasional table sat the heavy silver-gilt goblet that had served as their theatrical prop the previous afternoon. The goblet lay on its side, its ornate surface catching the morning light in a way that seemed almost accusatory. A faint stain darkened the Persian carpet beneath, and the air held a barely perceptible sweetness that reminded Mr. Pembroke, with uncomfortable precision, of the hothouse flowers in Lady Constance's conservatory, beautiful but somehow cloying in their intensity. Upon the table, as if placed there with deliberate care, lay one of the Scarlet Invitations, its bright colour a stark contrast to the muted tones of the morning room. Mr. Pembroke approached with the careful steps of a man who understood that he was witnessing something that would require delicate handling. Mrs. Ashcroft's face bore an expression of what might have been surprise, or perhaps simply the absence of the careful social mask she had worn so consistently in life. There was no violence evident, no disorder to suggest struggle, only the profound stillness that marked the difference between sleep and its more permanent cousin. With the methodical precision that had made him invaluable to Lady Constance, Mr. Pembroke withdrew from the room without disturbing anything, closing the door with the same quiet efficiency he brought to all his duties. His steps up the main staircase were measured, betraying nothing of the gravity of his errand to any servant who might observe his passage. Lady Constance's private sitting room was located in the family wing, a sanctuary of pale blue silk and carefully arranged family photographs, where she conducted her morning correspondence. He found her seated at her escritoire, already dressed in a morning gown of dove-grey wool, her silver hair arranged with its customary precision. She looked up from a letter she was writing. Something about the Children's Shelter Committee, he noted automatically, and saw in his expression the kind of news that could not wait for the proper moment. "What is it, Pembroke?" Her voice carried the calm authority of one accustomed to managing crises without theatricality. "I'm afraid, my lady, that Mrs. Ashcroft appears to have been taken ill during the night, most seriously ill." His choice of words was careful, preserving dignity while conveying the essential truth. Lady Constance set down her pen with deliberate precision, her hands steady despite the implication of his announcement. "I see. You have examined the situation?" "From a respectful distance, my lady. I believe it would be advisable to telephone Dr. Beecham immediately." "Of course." She rose from her chair with the composed grace that had carried her through 40 years of social obligations and domestic responsibilities. "And Pembroke, I think we should disturb the other guests as little as possible until we understand the circumstances more clearly." Dr. Beecham arrived within the half hour, his familiar presence bringing a measure of professional calm to the household's quiet distress. A man of 70 who had attended 3 generations of the Windermere family, he possessed the comfortable authority of long experience with both the mysteries of medicine and the delicate social protocols that governed houses like this one. His examination of Mrs. Ashcroft was conducted with gentle efficiency, though Lady Constance noticed the slight frown that creased his brow as he completed his preliminary assessment. "I'm afraid, Constance, that this appears to be more than a simple case of heart failure," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of professional concern. "The circumstances suggest that we should involve the proper authorities. It's always better that these matters be handled with complete correctness." Lady Constance received this news with a composure that had been bred into her bones. "Naturally, Doctor, whatever you think proper." The telephone call to the local constabulary was made with the same discretion that marked all of Lady Constance's communications with the outside world. Within the hour, a motor car appeared on the drive, its occupants emerging with the quiet efficiency of professionals accustomed to maintaining dignity even in the most trying circumstances. Inspector Roderick Alleyn stepped into the morning room of Windermere House with the unhurried grace of a man who understood that haste was the enemy of observation. Tall and lean, with intelligent grey eyes, and the bearing of one equally comfortable in drawing-rooms or witness boxes, he brought to the scene an air of cultured authority that seemed to ease the household's tension rather than increase it. "Lady Windermere," he said, his voice carrying the modulated tones of education tempered by experience, "I'm Inspector Alleyn. I understand there has been a death in your household, and I'm sorry for the disturbance this must cause you and your guests." "Thank you, Inspector. Mrs. Ashcroft was staying with us to participate in our theatrical production for charity. She was—" Lady Constance paused, choosing her words with characteristic precision. "A lady of somewhat theatrical temperament, but certainly not one given to melodrama in matters of health." Alleyn's attention moved to the still figure in the chair, taking in the scene with systematic care. The goblet, the invitation, the careful arrangement of the room, all spoke of something more deliberate than natural death. "Has anything been disturbed since the discovery?" "Nothing whatsoever. Mr. Pembroke found her and immediately informed me. We thought it best to preserve everything exactly as it was." Lady Constance watched as the inspector's gaze lingered on the silver-gilt goblet, noting the way his eyes seemed to catalogue each detail without appearing to stare. "Very wise," Alleyn murmured, his tone suggesting both approval and something deeper, a recognition that this scene had been arranged with a precision that spoke of careful planning. "I shall need to speak with everyone who was present yesterday evening, though I hope to manage it with minimal disruption to your household's routine." As if summoned by his words, the sound of voices drifted down from the upper floors, the other members of their theatrical company beginning to stir, unaware that their amateur dramatics had been overshadowed by a performance of far more serious consequence. The morning light, now fully established, illuminated the morning room with pitiless clarity, transforming what had been a place of comfortable social gathering into something approaching a stage set, one where the final curtain had already fallen on Mrs. Vivian Ashcroft's last unwilling performance. Inspector Alleyn's examination of the morning room proceeded with the unhurried precision of a scholar studying an illuminated manuscript, each detail contributing to an understanding that transcended mere physical evidence. He moved through the space with that quality of attention which transforms observation into art, his trained eye cataloguing not merely what was present, but what was absent, what was expected, and what whispered of careful arrangement. The silver-gilt goblet commanded his particular scrutiny. It lay on its side with the studied carelessness of a prop positioned for maximum effect, its ornate Georgian surface catching the morning light in a way that seemed almost accusatory. The residue within suggested wine, though something in the faint, cloying sweetness that lingered in the air hinted at additional complexity, a perfume that reminded him uncomfortably of the hothouse flowers in Lady Constance's conservatory, but attenuated, as if filtered through some intermediary substance. He knelt briefly beside the Queen Anne chair, noting how Mrs. Ashcroft sat with her head tilted against the high back, her hands folded with an aesthetic precision that spoke more of arrangement than natural repose. There was no violence evident, no disorder to suggest struggle, only that profound stillness which marked the difference between sleep and its more permanent cousin. The dark stain on the Persian carpet beneath the goblet formed an irregular blossom against the muted floral pattern, a small testimony to the moment when the vessel had completed its fatal purpose. The Scarlet Invitation lay beside the overturned goblet with the deliberate placement of a calling card left after a social visit. Alleyn studied it without touching, noting how the morning light seemed to intensify its vivid colour, making it appear less like a discarded item than a signature, someone's final ironic punctuation mark to the evening's events. "The room appears undisturbed, Lady Windermere," he observed, straightening with fluid grace. "My thanks to Mr. Pembroke for his prompt and judicious actions. The preservation of the scene is invaluable." His voice carried that particular quality of cultured authority that seemed to ease rather than increase the household's tension. Dr. Beecham approached with the measured steps of one accustomed to moving through scenes of quiet tragedy. "Inspector, I've completed my preliminary examination. While I cannot be entirely certain without further investigation, the circumstances suggest that Mrs. Ashcroft consumed something that disagreed with her rather severely. The rapidity of the onset and the particular symptoms suggest something more than natural causes. When might this have occurred, in your estimation?" "Sometime after midnight, I should think. Possibly as late as 2 or 3 o'clock. The positioning suggests she came here of her own volition. There's no evidence of coercion. She appears to have sat down, consumed whatever was in that goblet, and simply waited." Lady Constance, who had maintained her composure with the steady grace that had carried her through 40 years of social obligations, spoke with careful control. "The morning room is not typically used after dinner, Inspector. Our guests would normally retire to the drawing room or the library for the evening. It's curious that Vivienne would have chosen to come here at such an hour." "Unless she had arranged to meet someone," Alleyn observed quietly, his words settling into the morning stillness with inevitable weight. "The invitation suggests a degree of formality to whatever brought her here. Someone took considerable care with the arrangements." The sound of approaching footsteps announced the stirring of the household's remaining guests. Alleyn listened with the attention of a conductor noting the various instruments of his orchestra, Mr. Harrington's measured baritone discussing the morning's weather with characteristic authority, Miss Thornfield's lighter tones providing counterpoint, her words indistinct but carrying that quality of careful politeness that had marked her speech the previous afternoon. "Perhaps," he suggested, "it would be advisable to inform your guests of the situation before they encounter it accidentally. Shock, while sometimes revealing, is rarely kind to those who experience it." As if summoned by his words, Mr. Geoffrey Harrington appeared at the threshold, his dressing gown of crimson silk flowing with unconscious theatricality. His eyes, though wide with what he clearly intended as shock, held a glint of something approaching morbid fascination. The pink rawness about his jaw suggested hasty shaving, and his gaze moved immediately from the still figure in the chair to Alleyn, with the professional instinct to appeal to whatever authority might ensure the most favourable notice. "Good heavens!" he exclaimed, his voice carrying just slightly too much volume for genuine surprise. "Vivienne? What on earth has happened? Is she unwell?" Alleyn met his gaze with calm steadiness that seemed to strip away artifice. "I'm Inspector Alleyn, Mr. Harrington. I'm afraid Mrs. Ashcroft is no longer with us. We believe she passed away sometime during the night." Behind Harrington, Miss Diana Thornfield appeared with that ghost-like quietness that seemed characteristic of her presence at Windermere. She wore a simple dark dress, her fair hair pulled back with severe precision, and her face held that translucent pallor which spoke of genuine shock rather than performed emotion. Her eyes went directly to Mrs. Ashcroft, and a small involuntary sound escaped her lips. Not the theatrical gasp one might expect, but something more fundamental, the sound of someone confronting mortality without preparation. Alleyn observed them both with clinical detachment, noting how each brought their own atmosphere to the scene. Harrington, with his barely concealed excitement masquerading as concern. Miss Thornfield, whose quiet distress seemed to emanate from some deeper source than mere social obligation. The contrast was instructive, one performing grief, the other experiencing it. Mr. Pembroke stood slightly apart, his face maintaining that mask of polite concern which had served him through 3 decades of managing delicate situations. Yet Alleyn caught the brief, almost imperceptible movement of his eyes toward the Scarlet Invitation, then back to meet his own gaze, a moment of silent communication that suggested understanding beyond words. "I shall need to speak with each of you individually," Alleyn said, his tone carrying gentle authority. "But first, perhaps we might allow the household to proceed as nearly as possible, according to its usual routine. Breakfast as customary, if you please. The maintenance of normal patterns often reveals more than their disruption." Lady Constance inclined her head with characteristic efficiency. "Certainly, Inspector. The library is at your disposal for whatever interviews you require. It encourages calm discussion rather than dramatic displays." As the small group began to disperse, Alleyn remained for a moment longer in the morning room, his attention caught by a detail previously overlooked. On the mantelpiece, among the usual collection of family photographs and ornamental pieces, stood a second goblet, the mate to the one that had served such fatal purpose. This one remained upright and apparently unused, its silver surface reflecting the morning light with innocent brilliance, yet its very presence seemed to mock the scene with suggestions of symmetry and deliberate choice. He took one final survey of the room, committing each nuance to memory, the careful positioning of the body, the theatrical placement of the evidence, the window left slightly ajar as if to release some lingering essence into the morning air. Everything spoke of a mind that understood the power of symbolic gesture, someone who valued aesthetics as much as effectiveness. The amateur theatricals of the previous day had been supershadowed by a performance of far more serious consequence, and Alleyn found himself facing a killer who appreciated that murder, like theatre, could be elevated from mere crime to something approaching art. "I believe," he murmured to himself as he moved toward the door, "it's time to meet the remaining members of our cast." The library at Wintermere House possessed that quality of scholarly repose which encourages confidential conversation while discouraging theatrical displays. Morning light filtered through tall leaded windows, illuminating leather-bound volumes that had absorbed decades of whispered confidences and careful revelations. Inspector Alleyn had chosen his interview room with characteristic precision, understanding that environment often determined the quality of truth one might expect to receive. He positioned himself at the mahogany desk with deliberate informality, his notebook open but unobtrusive, creating an atmosphere more reminiscent of a gentleman's club than an interrogation room. The Persian rugs beneath absorbed sound with the discretion of well-trained servants, while the fire whispered, rather than burned, adding warmth without drama to the proceedings. Mr. Geoffrey Harrington entered first, his bearing carrying that studied casualness which actors employ when they wish to suggest depth beneath surface charm. He had changed into a tweed suit of impeccable cut, though Alleyn noted the slight tremor in hands that were otherwise carefully controlled, and the faint puffiness beneath eyes that suggested his night had been less restful than he might claim. "Inspector," Harrington began, his voice carrying its customary resonance, "this is absolutely ghastly. Poor Vivian. Whatever one thought of her interpretive choices, she certainly didn't deserve such a final curtain." He settled into the wing-backed chair with practiced grace, though his fingers drummed against the armrest with unconscious rhythm. "You knew Mrs. Ashcroft well, I take it?" Alleyn's tone carried gentle authority, encouraging confidence without demanding it. "We moved in similar theatrical circles, naturally. Those of us with professional experience tend to, well, one recognises quality when one encounters it." The slight pause suggested that Mrs. Ashcroft's quality had been more aspirational than actual. "She was tremendously enthusiastic about our little production. though her interpretation of Gertrude was rather more melodramatic than classical tradition might warrant. Alleyn made a careful note, observing how Harrington's professional pride seemed to war with something approaching relief. "Did you have occasion to speak with her after yesterday's rehearsal?" "Briefly. She seemed rather agitated about the blocking, had very definite ideas about how scenes should be played, though not always ideas that aligned with received wisdom." Harrington's voice carried the particular exasperation of one whose expertise had been questioned by an amateur. "She mentioned something about people not appreciating her dedication to the role." "When did you last see her alive?" Harrington's gaze shifted momentarily toward the window. "During tea, I believe. She was discussing costume details with Lady Constance, something about the authenticity of jewellery she intended to wear. Vivienne was quite particular about such matters." He paused, then added with careful casualness, "I retired early with a volume of Don and some rather excellent brandy. Quite absorbed until the small hours, actually." When Harrington departed, he left behind an atmosphere of carefully managed information, as if he had performed a scene while deliberately omitting crucial lines. Alleyn noted the contrast between the man's theatrical confidence and the underlying nervousness that suggested more complicated feelings about the deceased than mere artistic disagreement. Miss Diana Thornfield entered with that ghost-like quietness that seemed characteristic of her presence at Windermere. She had retained the dark dress she had donned upon hearing the news, and her fair hair remained pulled back with severe precision that emphasized the translucent pallor of her complexion. When she settled into the chair recently vacated by Harrington, she seemed to diminish rather than fill the space. "I'm sorry to trouble you at such a distressing time, Miss Thornfield," Alleyn began, his tone carrying particular gentleness for witnesses whose distress appeared genuine rather than performed. "It's quite all right, Inspector." Her voice held carefully modulated tones that spoke of education beyond her current circumstances. "I keep thinking I should have heard something, some sound that might have helped, but my room is in the East Wing and I sleep rather soundly." "You were fond of Mrs. Ashcroft?" A shadow of genuine pain crossed her features. "She was kind to me when others might not have been. My situation here is somewhat irregular, and Vivienne never made me feel as though I were accepting charity. She spoke to me as if I were a proper member of the company." The admission was made with quiet dignity that spoke well of both women. "Did she confide any particular concerns to you?" Miss Thornfield's hands twisted in her lap with unconscious anxiety. "She mentioned feeling somewhat unwelcome by certain members of our group. She believed some people resented her casting as Gertrude, though she tried not to let it affect her performance." The delicate phrasing suggested Mrs. Ashcroft's sensitivity had been more than mere artistic temperament. "When did you last speak with her?" "Yesterday evening, after tea, she asked if I would like to walk in the garden before dinner, but I declined. I had mending to attend to. She seemed disappointed, and now I wonder if she had something particular she wished to discuss." The regret in her voice was unmistakable, carrying the weight of opportunities forever lost. When Miss Thornfield departed, she left behind an atmosphere of genuine sorrow that contrasted sharply with Harrington's performed concern. Alleyn sat quietly for several minutes, understanding that he was beginning to see the outline of Mrs. Ashcroft's final hours, a woman seeking acceptance in a world that tolerated rather than embraced her presence. Mr. Pembroke's entrance returned the room to measured temperature. He seated himself with the precise movements of one accustomed to managing delicate situations, his notebook open, and his manner suggesting helpful discretion rather than defensive caution. "I fear, Inspector, that my schedule last evening was disobligingly ordinary," he began with characteristic precision. "I attended to correspondence until 10:15, assisted Lady Constance with several invitations, and then went in search of Mr. Harrington regarding a guest list he had neglected to return. The goblets used in your rehearsal, can you account for their whereabouts?" Pembroke's expression sharpened with professional interest. "After tea, I arranged for both to be carried to the small dining room. Mr. Swithins, our butler, placed one in the plate safe before supper. The second was left out due to a small dent in the rim, to be shown to Lady Constance this morning for assessment." He paused meaningfully. "It appears it was shown to someone else instead." "And the Scarlet Invitations?" "I left a stack upon the morning-room table after Lady Constance signed several. I collected none from there after 10 o'clock. His tone carried the weight of a man whose precision in such matters was a point of professional pride. "Mrs. Ashcroft did not, to my knowledge, write any correspondence last night. She preferred verbal communication. Alleyn leaned forward slightly. Had there been any recent friction between Mrs. Ashcroft and other members of the household? A flicker, no more than one beat of hesitation, crossed Pembroke's features. Mrs. Ashcroft occasionally expressed dissatisfaction with what she perceived as insufficient appreciation for her contributions. Recently she had hinted at attaching conditions to a further subscription to the children's shelter. What manner of conditions? The replacement of Miss Thornfield in the role of Ophelia. The words were delivered with careful neutrality, though their implications hung in the air like smoke. Lady Constance did not accept the suggestion. The revelation settled into the library's scholarly silence with the weight of genuine motive. Alleyn made careful notations, understanding that he had uncovered not merely artistic disagreement, but financial leverage wielded with potentially fatal consequences. As Pembroke prepared to depart, Alleyn posed one final question. In your experience, Mr. Pembroke, who in this household would have the most complete knowledge of its routines and the movements of its occupants? Mr. Swithin's, without question. He has served the family for 15 years and possesses that particular awareness that belongs only to the most accomplished household staff. He observes everything and forgets nothing, though he speaks only when properly approached. Pembroke's tone carried respectful acknowledgement of professional expertise. When the secretary departed, Alleyn remained in the library's contemplative silence, reviewing the morning's revelations. The interviews had revealed not merely alibis and timelines, but the complex web of relationships that had surrounded Mrs. Ashcroft's final hours. Financial pressure, artistic resentment, and social insecurity had created a volatile mixture beneath Windermere's elegant surface. The sound of approaching footsteps announced the next phase of his investigation. Mr. Swithin's appeared in the doorway with that particular discretion, which suggested not only good training, but years of experience in managing household crises without disturbing the social equilibrium. "You wish to speak with me, Inspector?" His voice carried the modulated tones of one accustomed to being present without becoming intrusive, and his eyes held that quality of careful observation which Alleyn recognised as potentially invaluable. "Indeed, Mr. Swithin's, I believe you may be able to illuminate certain aspects of last evening's events that others might have overlooked." Alleyn gestured to the chair with courteous respect, understanding that the butler's cooperation would require acknowledgement of his professional dignity. As the morning light shifted across the library's scholarly calm, Alleyn prepared to enter the parallel world of the servants' quarters, where different truths might be spoken and different secrets kept. In houses like Windermere, he had learned, those who served often knew far more than those who were served, and their discretion was purchased not with conspiracy, but with the understanding that some knowledge was too dangerous to reveal without proper cause. The game was indeed progressing, though at Windermere House it would be played according to rules that prize subtlety over sensation, and where the final revelation would arrive not with theatrical flourish, but with the quiet inevitability of truth carefully extracted from those who had witnessed it unfold. Mr. Swithin's possessed that quality of professional invisibility which belonged only to the most accomplished household staff, present when needed, absent when not, and always aware of the delicate distinction between the two states. He entered the library with the measured dignity of one who had spent 15 years managing the intricate choreography of domestic life at Windermere, his weathered features carrying the accumulated wisdom of 3 generations of family service. "Inspector," he began, settling into the wing-backed chair with careful attention to propriety, "I understand you wish to know about last evening's arrangements. I should be happy to assist in whatever manner proves helpful." His voice carried the modulated tones of one accustomed to being heard without commanding attention, each word precisely chosen and delivered with professional discretion. Alleyn appreciated the butler's careful phrasing, recognising in it the diplomatic precision of one who had spent years navigating the treacherous waters between loyalty and truth. "I'm particularly interested in the movements of the household after 10 o'clock, Mr. Swithin's. The servant's perspective often reveals patterns that escape the notice of those more directly involved." A flicker of acknowledgement crossed Swithin's features. "Indeed, sir. We do tend to observe rather more than we speak of, as a matter of professional necessity." He paused, arranging his thoughts with characteristic precision. "After serving tea in the drawing-room, I attended to the clearing of theatrical properties. The silver-gilt goblets were among the items requiring particular attention. Can you account for their whereabouts throughout the evening?" Swithin's response came with the exactitude of a man whose professional reputation depended upon such details. I placed one goblet in the plate safe as usual, sir, the undamaged piece. The second remained in the small dining room due to a minor dent in the rim, which Lady Constance wished to examine this morning. Both had been thoroughly cleaned after their use in rehearsal. His tone carried the particular pride of one whose standards in such matters were beyond reproach. You mentioned the plate safe, Mr. Swithins. Who has access to it? The butler's expression grew more guarded, his professional discretion warring with the obvious importance of complete truthfulness. I hold the primary key, sir. There is a duplicate in Lady Constance's escritoire, sealed, of which Mr. Pembroke is aware. No one else has authorised access. He paused, then added with reluctant precision. However, I have reason to believe the safe was opened during the night. Alleyn's attention sharpened. Your reason? I maintain certain habits, sir, regarding the position of the lock mechanism. This morning the ward was not as I had left it. Swithins delivered this information with the neutral precision of a professional witness, yet the implications were unmistakable. And the dented goblet, where exactly did you place it? On the small table in the morning room, sir, beside the scarlet invitations that Mr. Pembroke had arranged there, after Lady Constance signed them. I intended to show the damage to her ladyship this morning. Swithin's voice carried a note of professional concern. It appears it was shown to someone else instead. The revelation that both goblet and invitations had been deliberately placed in the morning room added another layer to the evening's carefully orchestrated events. Alleyn made careful notations, understanding that Mrs. Ashcroft's final hours had been shaped by the household's own routines. What of the evening's activities after 10 o'clock? Swithins considered for a moment, not in hesitation, but in the meticulous ordering of facts. Mrs. Ashcroft remained in the drawing-room after the others departed, sir, reviewing her script. She seemed quieter than usual, a certain pensiveness that was not characteristic of her customary, spirited temperament. The diplomatic phrasing could not entirely disguise his assessment of the deceased's personality. She did request that the morning room windows be open to encourage circulation, which I attended to at approximately 10:45. She specifically requested access to the morning room? Indeed, sir, she mentioned feeling rather warm and expressed hope for a private conversation with someone regarding the production. She seemed to feel that certain matters required clarification before the performance. Alleyn noted how each detail contributed to a picture of deliberate preparation rather than chance encounter. Did you observe her again after that? Briefly, sir. I saw her return to collect her script from the drawing-room, then proceed upstairs. This would have been shortly after 10 o'clock. I was attending to my usual evening duties, locking the ground-floor windows and extinguishing lamps. Swithins paused, his professional memory cataloguing the evening's events. I completed my rounds and retired to my quarters at 11:30, after ensuring all was secure. When Swithins departed, he left behind an atmosphere of carefully managed revelation, each detail contributing to Alleyn's understanding of the evening's choreography. The inspector remained briefly in contemplation before requesting the next witness. Mrs. Lohman, the housekeeper, entered with the brisk authority of one accustomed to managing both linen and temperaments with equal efficiency. Her testimony provided corroborating detail delivered with practical precision. Miss Thornfield requesting thread at 10:30, Mr. Harrington's request for a hot water bottle at 11:15, the household's general retirement at reasonable hours. Mrs. Ashcroft had her own preparations, Inspector, Mrs. Lohman added with characteristic directness. Her smelling salts, and a little bottle of tonic. Quinine, she said, though she disliked the smell initially. She took it only in the mornings, as a rule. Kitty, the under-housemaid, provided the final piece of the servant's testimony, her nervousness evident as she clutched her apron in the library's scholarly atmosphere. Mrs. Ashcroft was in her wrapper when I brought the hot water with lemon, sir. Pink silk with black lace trim. She had her jewellery case open on the bed, and there was a red card on her writing table, one of them with the crest. She'd written something on it in pencil, I think. The detail of Mrs. Ashcroft preparing her own Scarlet Invitation provided another element of premeditation to the evening's events. Alleyn noted how the servants' observations, when assembled, revealed a pattern of careful preparation that extended beyond mere chance or impulse. As the morning progressed and the servants' testimony accumulated, Alleyn found himself with a clearer picture of the evening's choreography. The dented goblet had been placed precisely where it could serve its fatal purpose. Access to the plate safe had been achieved through knowledge of household routines, and Mrs. Ashcroft herself had participated in arranging the circumstances of her own demise. Yet questions remained that would require more than servants' observations to resolve. The mechanics of the evening were becoming clear, but the psychology behind them, the pressures that had transformed amateur theatricals into genuine tragedy, still required investigation. Someone among Windermere's elegant company possessed both the knowledge and the ruthlessness necessary to exploit the household's routines for murderous purpose. The sound of approaching footsteps announced the next phase of his investigation. Lady Constance appeared in the doorway with that measured grace which had carried her through 40 years of social obligations, her expression suggesting controlled concern rather than defensive anxiety. "Inspector," she said, her voice carrying its customary authority tempered by genuine courtesy, "I hope the staff have been helpful. They possess excellent memories for detail, though their discretion sometimes requires careful encouragement." As Lady Constance settled into the chair with characteristic composure, Alleyn prepared to enter the most delicate phase of his investigation. The servants had provided the framework of the evening's events, but the lady of the house possessed information that could illuminate the deeper currents of motive and opportunity that had culminated in Mrs. Ashcroft's carefully staged death. The morning light continued its measured progress across the library's scholarly calm, marking time in a house where someone had already demonstrated that the preservation of social forms could serve as both shield and weapon in a game where the stakes were nothing less than life and death. Lady Constance Windermere settled into the wing-back chair with that unconscious grace which spoke of generations of breeding, her dove-grey morning dress arranged with precision that appeared effortless yet was clearly the result of long habit. Her hands, pale and elegant despite her 62 years, rested quietly in her lap, though Alleyn noted the slight tension in her fingers that suggested the morning's events had affected her more deeply than her composed exterior might indicate. "Inspector," she began, her voice carrying the modulated authority that had managed households and charitable committees with equal efficiency, "I hope you will understand that this situation presents certain delicacies. Mrs. Ashcroft was my guest, and whatever her failings, she deserved better than such an end." The carefully chosen words suggested both genuine regret and something approaching relief, a combination that Alleyn found instructive. "You knew Mrs. Ashcroft well, Lady Windermere?" A shadow of what might have been weariness crossed her features. "We moved in overlapping social circles, Inspector. Vivian was generous with her subscriptions to various charities, though she occasionally attached conditions that made her beneficence somewhat complicated to manage." The diplomatic phrasing could not entirely disguise the underlying frustration. She possessed strong opinions about how organization should be conducted, particularly when her financial contributions were substantial. Alleyn made careful notations, recognizing the delicate balance between gratitude and exasperation that characterized many relationships with demanding benefactors. "I understand she had expressed certain views regarding the casting of your theatrical production." Lady Constance's composure flickered momentarily, revealing depths beneath her social mask. Vivian felt that her interpretation of Gertrude deserved a more compatible Ophelia. She believed Miss Thornfield's approach was insufficiently dramatic for the production she envisioned. The words were chosen with characteristic precision, yet they carried undertones of steel. I did not agree with her assessment. This disagreement, was it merely artistic? The question hung in the library's scholarly silence, while Lady Constance considered her response with the care of one accustomed to navigating treacherous social waters. Vivian had suggested that her continued support for the children's shelter might depend upon certain adjustments to our arrangements. She felt that Miss Thornfield's presence reflected poorly on the production's overall quality. Her voice carried controlled distaste for such manipulation. I informed her that artistic decisions would be made on merit rather than financial pressure. The revelation of Mrs. Ashcroft's attempted coercion cast her final evening in a different light, suggesting motives that extended beyond mere theatrical ambition. Alleyn noted how Lady Constance's protective instincts toward Miss Thornfield had clearly been engaged by such threats. "When did this conversation take place?" 3 days ago, in my private sitting room. Vivian had requested a confidential discussion about the production's direction. Lady Constance's tone suggested the unpleasant surprise of discovering ulterior motives beneath apparent artistic concern. She was quite direct about her expectations, though she phrased them as suggestions for the production's improvement. "Might I examine that sitting room, Lady Windermere?" The scene of such conversations often retains traces of their significance. Lady Constance led him to her private sanctuary, whose pale blue serenity was a precise antidote to the library's brown and gold gravity. Everything here was arranged in that particular order, which speaks less of tidiness than of a habit of mind. Flowers in a low bowl, 2 photographs in silver frames, a clock that moved audibly but without haste. The escritoire stood by the window, its lid raised, the interior compartments marshalled with gentle severity. "The Scarlet Invitations," Alleyn observed, noting the small stack upon the desk. "Mr. Pembroke mentioned that several were left in the morning room yesterday evening." "Quite correct. I finished my correspondence for the day and he was to collect them this morning for addressing." Lady Constance watched as Alleyn examined the cards with careful attention. "One doesn't typically write personal notes on formal invitations, Inspector. They are for public events, not private correspondence." Alleyn's attention moved to the escritoire's narrow drawer, which Lady Constance opened without hesitation. Inside lay small envelopes marked in Mr. Pembroke's clean hand, including one labelled "Key, Plate Safe, Duplicate," bearing a blob of red wax stamped with the Windermere crest. He examined the seal without breaking it, tilting the packet so that light from the window angled across the wax. Under that pale illumination, the impression showed a minute irregularity, a tiny chip along the rim that the signet on the desk did not share. "You keep these sealed as a matter of routine?" "Always. My husband liked to know if his orders were obeyed." She allowed herself the faintest smile. "I continued the habit." Alleyn noted the faint, clean rectangle beneath where the packet had lain, bordered by the ghostly outline of powdered graphite from pencil shavings, evidence that the envelope had been recently moved. On the blotter pad, the top sheet had been turned corner to corner rather than front to back. He took a sheet of thin paper and held it over the blotter, angling it toward the window. The ghost of several words rose, reversed and pale. "Gertrude. 9. And a shape that might be the tail of a question mark. Do you use pencil for correspondence here, Lady Windermere?" "Never. Pencil is for lists made in the housekeeper's room. I consider it improper for formal correspondence." Her distress at this violation of protocol was evident. "The misuse of the Scarlet Invitation troubles me greatly, Inspector. It represents a fundamental disruption of proper social order, using a formal summons for private purposes." Following the thread of evidence, Alleyn requested to examine the conservatory, where the warm, faintly oppressive air was saturated with sweetness that reminded him uncomfortably of the morning room. Among the carefully tended flowers, he found the gardener's ledger with its systematic entries. The previous day's column showed a neat line. "Tuberose, 1 stem, requested 9 p.m, with initials that were more scratched than letters. "A single stem, requested after the household's normal requirements," he observed to Lady Constance, who had accompanied him with growing concern. "Most irregular. Our flower arrangements are planned in advance and delivered at proper hours." Her voice carried the particular distress of one whose world depended upon the maintenance of order. Returning to the morning room, Alleyn's systematic examination revealed further disturbances in the household's careful routines. Among the porcelain ornaments on the mantelpiece stood 2 small glass tubes for single stems, one with a trace of moisture, the other quite dry. The tantalus beneath the window showed its decanters in wrong positions, stoppers transposed, with a faint tackiness on the sherry stopper suggesting something syrupy had dried there. On the windowsill lay a match end, half burnt, with the faintest smear of red across its wood. Sealing wax, perhaps. "Inspector," Lady Constance said quietly, observing his methodical cataloguing of these small violations, "someone has exploited my household's routines with considerable knowledge and deliberate intent. This is not the work of an outsider, but of someone who understands how we live, when we move, where our vulnerabilities lie." As they returned to the library, the accumulated evidence painted a picture of careful preparation rather than impulsive action. The tampered seal, the penciled notes, the deliberately requested flower, the misplaced decanters, all spoke of a mind that understood the power of symbolic gesture and the exploitation of established patterns. "The Scarlet Invitation troubles you particularly," Alleyn observed. "It represents everything wrong about this affair, Inspector. A formal instrument of hospitality perverted into something secretive and ultimately deadly. It suggests someone who not only understood our customs but took pleasure in corrupting them." Lady Constance's voice carried both anger and profound sadness. Vivienne may have been difficult, but she deserved better than to be lured to her death by the violation of every social grace she sought to embrace. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor announced another development in the day's carefully managed revelations. Through the library windows, the afternoon light had begun its measured decline, casting longer shadows across the grounds of Wintermere House. Someone among the elegant company possessed both the intimate knowledge and the cold calculation necessary to transform the household's own routines into instruments of murder, and Alleyn found himself facing a killer who understood that in a world governed by social forms, the greatest weapon might be the corruption of civility itself. Mr. Swithins appeared in the doorway with that particular discretion which suggested not routine service but news of significance. "Inspector, there has been a telephone call from the village. Dr. Beecham requests your immediate attention regarding certain findings from his preliminary examination. He suggests the matter cannot wait for the formal post-mortem." The day's careful progression was about to encounter another ripple in its surface, one that would either confirm Alleyn's growing suspicions or force him to reconsider the entire architecture of the crime that had transformed amateur theatricals into genuine tragedy. Dr. Beecham's surgery occupied a converted Georgian house, whose medical efficiency had been carefully balanced with the comfort expected by patients accustomed to a certain standard of treatment. The elderly physician greeted Alleyn with the grave courtesy of one who had spent 40 years managing the delicate intersection between medical necessity and social discretion, his weathered features carrying the weight of professional concern that could not wait for formal channels. "Inspector," he began without preamble, leading Alleyn into his book-lined study where afternoon light filtered through tall windows, "my preliminary examination has revealed certain complications that transform our understanding of Mrs. Ashcroft's final hours entirely. The cause of death was not as straightforward as initial appearances suggested." On his mahogany desk lay several small vials and a delicate silver spoon, no larger than one might use for salt, its ornate handle bearing theatrical masks in relief. Dr. Beecham gestured to these items with the precision of one accustomed to presenting evidence that would alter the course of investigations. "The agent responsible appears to be a highly concentrated extract of digitalis purpurea. Foxglove. To the layman," he continued, his voice carrying the measured authority of long experience. "Specifically, the cardiac glycosides digitoxin and digoxin, administered in what I believe was a carefully prepared tonic. The symptoms were entirely consistent. Cardiac arrhythmia followed by sudden, irreversible arrest. It explains the remarkable absence of struggle, the almost peaceful expression on her face." Alleyn examined the ornate spoon with growing understanding. The theatrical masks seemed to mock the morning's events with their eternal expressions of comedy and tragedy, while the delicate size suggested something designed for precise measurement rather than ordinary use. "A plant-based poison requiring considerable botanical knowledge, I take it." "Indeed. While foxglove grows wild throughout Kent, extracting and refining these compounds requires intimate understanding of herbal pharmacology, not to mention access to proper equipment for concentration." Dr. Beecham indicated a small, clear phial containing colourless liquid. "This was found among Mrs. Ashcroft's toiletries, her morning quinine tonic, which Mrs. Lohman mentioned she took regularly despite disliking the smell. Someone with knowledge of her habits used this familiar substance as the perfect vehicle." The revelation transformed Alleyn's understanding of the evening's choreography. Mrs. Ashcroft had not been murdered in the morning room, but had arrived there already carrying death within her, the poison administered some 30 to 45 minutes before her final collapse. The timing suggests she consumed the fatal dose between 11:15 and 11:30 last evening, then proceeded to her appointment in the morning room where the theatrical staging awaited her final performance. "Precisely, Inspector. The dosage was calculated with remarkable precision, enough to be lethal, but delayed sufficiently to allow her to complete whatever business brought her to that room. Someone with both botanical expertise and intimate knowledge of her personal routines orchestrated this with chilling sophistication. The drive back to Wintermere House traced familiar lanes where autumn light filtered through bare branches with the discretion of well-trained servants. Alleyn's thoughts dwelt on the implications of Dr. Beecham's findings. Someone among the elegant company possessed not only the botanical knowledge necessary to extract and concentrate digitalis, but also the cold calculation to exploit Mrs. Ashcroft's daily habits for murderous purpose. he arrived to find the household maintaining its careful facade of normalcy, though the atmosphere carried new undercurrents of tension. Lady Constance met him in the entrance hall with that controlled composure which had carried her through 40 years of managing domestic crises, yet her eyes held questions that spoke of growing anxiety. "Inspector," she began, her voice carrying its customary authority tempered by genuine concern, "there has been a rather disturbing development in your absence. A telegram arrived from Miss Thornfield, or rather, what purported to be a telegram from her Aunt Judith in London demanding her immediate return on urgent family business." Mr. Pembroke appeared with his characteristic discretion, bearing a folded paper upon a silver tray. "The message was discovered on the hall salver afternoon, Inspector. No messenger was announced, and the phrasing struck me as somewhat irregular for genuine family correspondence." Alleyn examined the document with careful attention. The writing was in pencil, light and careful, as if someone unused to urgency had attempted to imitate it. The phrasing carried an old-fashioned formality that seemed calculated rather than natural, and beneath it lay one of the Scarlet Invitations with 2 words added in the same hand: "At once." "Miss Thornfield's response?" he inquired. "She packed immediately, believing the instructions genuine," Lady Constance replied, her tone carrying controlled distaste for such manipulation. "Mr. Swithins had ordered the motor before I could intervene. Fortunately, we intercepted her before departure. They found Miss Thornfield in the drawing-room, her small valise beside her chair, and her composure showing signs of strain that went beyond mere confusion. The translucent pallor that had marked her features since morning had deepened into something approaching fragility, and her hands twisted in her lap with unconscious anxiety. "I beg your pardon for the confusion," she said, her voice carrying that brittleness of fine crystal under pressure. "When the message arrived, I naturally assumed, that is, given the circumstances, I thought there might be some wish to see me removed quietly from the household." "There is indeed such a wish," Alleyn observed gently, "but I suspect it originates not from Lady Windermere but from someone who finds your continued presence here inconvenient." The implication settled into the drawing-room's elegant atmosphere with inevitable weight. Someone had attempted to remove Miss Thornfield from Windermere House, at the precise moment when Alleyn's investigation was beginning to focus on motives and opportunities. The timing suggested not mere coincidence but careful calculation by someone who understood that the young woman's departure would serve their purposes. "Mr. Swithins," Alleyn requested, "might you telephone the village telegraph office to verify whether any message was transmitted today to Miss Thornfield from London?" The butler's response, delivered with characteristic precision, confirmed what Alleyn had suspected. "No message, Inspector. The office reports no telegrams to Miss Thornfield for several weeks past." A village boy, summoned by Swithin's discreet inquiries, provided the final piece of this particular puzzle. Standing in the library with his cap clutched in both hands, he described how a lady in a dark cloak had approached him the previous evening after 10 o'clock, requesting that he deliver a red card to Windermere House through the letterbox without announcement. "Couldn't see her face proper, sir, what with the scarf and all, but she had a pretty voice, spoke like a lady, gave me a shilling and said I weren't to knock or disturb anyone." The boy's testimony, delivered with the honesty of youth, provided crucial evidence that the morning room scene had been deliberately arranged by someone who understood the household's routines well enough to exploit them. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Windermere's carefully maintained grounds, Alleyn found himself facing a killer who had demonstrated remarkable sophistication in both planning and execution. The crime had been conceived not merely as murder, but as a form of theatrical production, complete with symbolic props, careful timing, and an understanding of how social forms could be corrupted into instruments of death. The digitalis had been administered through Mrs. Ashcroft's familiar morning tonic, exploiting her established habits with clinical precision. The morning room staging had provided an appropriate setting for her final performance, while the forged telegram represented an attempt to remove potential complications before the truth could be fully revealed. "The botanical knowledge required," Lady Constance observed quietly, her gaze moving toward the conservatory doors where exotic flowers bloomed under careful cultivation, "suggests someone with considerable expertise in such matters, not merely a casual gardener, but someone who understands the properties of plants and their alternative applications." The revelation hung in the air like incense, heavy with implication. Someone among Windermere's elegant company possessed both the scientific knowledge and the artistic sensibility necessary to transform murder into performance art, using the household's own routines and Mrs. Ashcroft's personal habits as instruments in a symphony of calculated death. The endgame was approaching, though at Windermere House it would arrive not with dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet revelation of truths that had been hidden beneath layers of social propriety and botanical expertise. The Scarlet Invitation had indeed summoned Mrs. Ashcroft to her final performance, but the role she played had been written by someone who understood that in the theatre of murder, the most effective drama was often the most scientifically precise. The conservatory at Windermere House possessed that quality of controlled wilderness which marked the finest examples of Victorian botanical ambition, where exotic specimens flourished under conditions more carefully managed than many drawing rooms. Inspector Alleyn had requested that tea be served among the palms and orchids, understanding that atmosphere could prove as revealing as direct questioning, and that the proximity to growing things might encourage certain truths to surface naturally. Lady Constance presided over the ritual with her customary grace, though Alleyn noted the slight tension in her movements as she arranged cups and saucers on the bamboo table. The air hung thick with humidity and the intoxicating sweetness of blooms that spoke of careful cultivation and intimate botanical knowledge. Among the single-stem vases scattered about the conservatory, one slender glass held a white tuberose whose scent, while discreet, possessed an insistence that seemed to permeate the afternoon stillness. The assembled company took their places with the careful courtesy of actors who understood their roles but remained uncertain of the play's conclusion. Mr. Harrington accepted his cup with theatrical flourish, his gaze falling upon the tuberose with what might have been recognition. "The very perfume of mortality," he observed, his voice carrying that quality of studied quotation which some actors employ in private conversation. Sweet to the point of suffocation, one might say. Miss Thornfield's response to the flower proved more instructive than Harrington's theatrical commentary. She accepted her tea with quiet thanks, but when the tuberose's scent reached her, she drew back slightly, not with distaste, but with the careful recognition of someone who understood the flower's significance beyond mere ornament. Her pale hands trembled almost imperceptibly as she steadied her cup, and her gaze moved briefly toward the conservatory's working areas before returning to her lap with studied composure. Mr. Pembroke, ever attentive to household management, moved to open an upper casement, allowing the heavy air to circulate more freely. His hand, reaching back toward the table to adjust a napkin, showed the slightest tremor, a detail that in another man might have indicated mere nervousness, but in Pembroke suggested something approaching genuine discomposure. "I believe," Alleyn said with gentle authority, "that we should examine the conservatory's working areas more thoroughly. The preparation of botanical specimens often requires specialized knowledge and equipment." Lady Constance led him to the potting shed, where leather-bound journals filled with careful notations sat alongside more recent editions whose pages showed signs of regular consultation. The discovery proved illuminating. One journal lay open on the workbench, its pages marked with pressed specimens and detailed notes regarding the extraction and concentration of various plant essences. The handwriting was unmistakably feminine, though not in Lady Constance's characteristic style. Beside it, a portfolio of botanical illustrations rendered each specimen with scientific precision yet artistic sensibility, while marginal notes detailed extraction methods and therapeutic applications with disturbing thoroughness. "Miss Thornfield has been consulting these materials extensively," Lady Constance admitted, her voice carrying new uncertainty as the implications became clear. She expressed interest in botanical illustration as a suitable occupation. Her drawings were quite accomplished, and she seemed to find solace in the scientific aspects of plant cultivation. The portfolio revealed intimate familiarity with plant properties that extended far beyond mere artistic interest. One drawing in particular commanded attention, a detailed study of Digitalis purpurea, with extensive notations regarding the preparation of cardiac tonics and their effects upon human physiology. The precision of the work spoke of systematic study conducted with purposes that transcended academic curiosity. Returning to the conservatory, Alleyn observed how Miss Thornfield had positioned herself near the window, where afternoon light illuminated her pale features with increasing clarity. Her small valise remained beside her chair like a prop awaiting its cue, while her composure showed subtle signs of strain that suggested the day's revelations were taking their toll. The botanical knowledge demonstrated in those journals is quite remarkable, Alleyn observed, settling into his chair with unhurried precision. The previous Lady Windermere's expertise in medicinal plants appears to have found an eager student. Miss Thornfield's response came with careful modulation, though something had shifted beneath the surface of her usual deference. Lady Constance has been most generous in allowing me access to such valuable resources. The scientific principles involved are quite fascinating, though some of the applications seem rather advanced for contemporary practice. The admission carried undertones that suggested familiarity with those advanced applications, while her gaze moved briefly toward the conservatory doors in a gesture that spoke of intimate knowledge of the growing spaces beyond. Alleyn noted how her hands, previously steady, now showed faint traces of graphite beneath the fingernails, evidence of recent work, with pencil that might explain certain markings on Scarlet Invitations. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, Alleyn conducted a series of seemingly routine inquiries that served to illuminate the household's various capabilities and knowledge. He requested signatures on administrative documents, observing how each member of the company approached the task of writing. Harrington flourished his fountain pen with theatrical emphasis, his left hand drumming restlessly, while his right maintained practiced control. Miss Thornfield took the offered pencil with shy precision, her clear script revealing the same careful attention to detail that marked her botanical illustrations. Mr. Pembroke signed with characteristic neatness, his blotter technique speaking of years of careful practice, though Alleyn noted the absence of any waxy residue on his cuffs that might suggest recent work with sealing materials. The systematic observation revealed patterns of behaviour and capability that would prove crucial to understanding how the evening's fatal choreography had been arranged. The accumulated evidence painted a picture of careful preparation, extending over weeks rather than hours. Someone among Windermere's elegant company had systematically acquired the botanical knowledge necessary to transform Mrs. Ashcroft's morning tonic from beneficial supplement into fatal dose, while simultaneously mastering the household's routines well enough to exploit them for murderous purpose. "I believe," Alleyn announced as the shadows lengthened across the conservatory's exotic blooms, "that we should resume our theatrical rehearsal this evening, a brief session, enough to observe how sound travels between these rooms and how the household's evening routines typically unfold. The maintenance of normal patterns often reveals more than their disruption." Lady Constance received this suggestion with characteristic efficiency, understanding that the inspector's request served purposes beyond mere curiosity about acoustics. "Certainly, Inspector. The drawing-room shall be prepared as before, though I suspect this evening's performance will prove more revealing than our previous efforts." As the company began to disperse, each member carrying their own burden of knowledge and anxiety, Alleyn remained briefly in the conservatory's manufactured Eden. The tuberous continued its silent testimony, while the journals and illustrations provided irrefutable evidence that someone had transformed Lady Constance's generous hospitality into opportunity for systematic study of lethal applications. The endgame was approaching with the inevitability of a well-constructed play reaching its climax. The botanical evidence, the forged communications, the exploitation of household routines, and the careful staging of Mrs. Ashcroft's final scene all pointed toward a mind that appreciated the aesthetic dimensions of murder as much as its practical necessities. Tonight's rehearsal would provide the final opportunity to observe how guilt moved through Windermere's elegant spaces, and how truth might finally emerge from the shadows of carefully maintained deception. The Scarlet Invitation had indeed summoned Mrs. Ashcroft to her final performance, but the playwright responsible was about to discover that Inspector Alleyn had been studying the script with equal attention to detail, and that the final curtain would fall on a revelation as carefully orchestrated as the crime itself. Evening descended upon Windermere House with the discretion of a well-trained servant, transforming familiar spaces into something approaching a stage set where truth and performance would intersect with inevitable consequence. Inspector Alleyn had requested that the drawing-room be restored to its theatrical configuration, understanding that the recreation of routine often revealed more than its disruption, and that atmosphere could prove as illuminating as direct interrogation. The assembled company took their places with the careful courtesy of actors uncertain whether they were performing or being performed upon. Lady Constance moved to her customary position with measured grace, though Alleyn noted the slight tension in her movements as she arranged the leather-bound scripts whose annotations now seemed to mock the evening's proceedings with reminders of more innocent theatrical ambitions. The fire whispered rather than burned, adding warmth without drama to proceedings that carried their own internal heat. The evening's acoustic revelations. "I believe we should examine how sound travels in these rooms," Alleyn announced with gentle authority, positioning himself near the mantelpiece where he could observe both the performance and the performers. "The voice carries curiously here, and I'm particularly interested in how conversations might be overheard from adjacent spaces." As the rehearsal commenced, he moved systematically between the drawing room, the corridor, and the morning room, noting how even whispered conversations carried with unexpected clarity. From the conservatory's position adjacent to the morning room, he observed, someone could easily monitor discussions without being detected, a discovery that cast Mrs. Ashcroft's final evening in a different light entirely. Lady Constance read Gertrude's lines with dignity that drained them of melodrama, while Mr. Harrington, unable to resist the pull of performance, delivered Hamlet's soliloquy with conviction that filled the room but travelled only faintly beyond its boundaries. When Alleyn returned from his acoustic investigations, he found the company maintaining their positions with that particular embarrassment that accompanies earnest amateur effort under professional scrutiny: the botanical performance. Miss Thornfield's interpretation of Ophelia proved most instructive. When her cue arrived, she rose with that ghost-like quietness that had marked her presence at Windermere, though something had shifted in her demeanour since the afternoon's discoveries in the conservatory. The translucent pallor that had characterised her features throughout the day had been replaced by a quality of brittle composure that spoke of internal pressures approaching their limits. "There's rosemary, that's for remembrance. Pray, love, remember," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, yet somehow filling the room completely. As she continued with Ophelia's mad scene, the botanical references took on layers of meaning that seemed to extend far beyond Shakespeare's intentions. "And there is pansies, that's for thoughts. There's fennel for you, and columbines. There's rue for you, and here's some for me. We may call it herb of grace o' Sundays." The words, delivered with intimate knowledge of each plant's properties, created an atmosphere of uncomfortable recognition among the assembled company. Alleyn observed how her movements through the performance space suggested familiarity with the room's acoustic qualities that extended beyond casual observation, while her delivery carried an authority that spoke of systematic study rather than mere textual analysis. Methodical evidence assembly. During a brief intermission, Alleyn conducted what appeared to be routine administrative inquiries that served to illuminate crucial details. He requested signatures on documents, observing how each member approached the task of writing. The systematic observation revealed patterns of behaviour and capability that painted a clearer picture of the evening's fatal choreography. Mr. Harrington's theatrical confidence showed signs of strain as he produced his ornate salt spoon. "Any man of taste carries his own," he explained with forced lightness, though his gaze moved nervously toward the conservatory doors. The spoon bore theatrical masks in relief, matching Dr. Beecham's description perfectly, while his signet ring proved to be a stage property bearing a heraldic device remarkably similar to Lady Windermere's crest. Close enough to satisfy cursory inspection, but bearing a telltale nick that matched the irregularity found on the tampered seal. Mr. Pembroke's revelation proved equally significant. "At 10:20 last night," he admitted with reluctant precision, "I discovered one Scarlet Invitation missing from the stack. At 10:30 I heard the distinctive sound of sealing wax being dropped in Lady Constance's sitting room, though she had retired. At 10:40 I encountered Mr. Harrington on the landing, carrying what appeared to be a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. The convergence of evidence." As the evening progressed, Alleyn's observations coalesced into a pattern that revealed both method and motive with chilling clarity. The botanical expertise demonstrated in Miss Thornfield's conservatory work, her intimate knowledge of plant properties extending far beyond artistic interest, her access to the materials, and knowledge necessary to extract and concentrate digitalis, all pointed toward capabilities that transcended innocent botanical illustration. The acoustic discoveries explained how someone positioned in the conservatory could monitor conversations in the morning room, providing both opportunity to overhear Mrs. Ashcroft's various conflicts and the means to arrange a fatal rendezvous. The forged telegram attempting to remove Miss Thornfield from the household suggested someone who understood that her continued presence might prove inconvenient to the investigation. The digitalis, Alleyn observed quietly, required not merely botanical knowledge, but the precise skill to extract and concentrate it into a form that could be administered through Mrs. Ashcroft's familiar morning tonic. Someone exploited her established habits with clinical precision, transforming a beneficial supplement into a fatal dose. Miss Thornfield's response to this observation proved most revealing. Her hands, previously steady despite the day's revelations, began to tremble almost imperceptibly, while her gaze moved from the conservatory doors to Lady Constance with what might have been either appeal or resignation. The approaching climax. As the rehearsal drew to its conclusion, the accumulated weight of evidence had created an atmosphere thick with unspoken understanding. Each participant seemed to be playing multiple roles, their theatrical characters, their social personas, and perhaps most significantly, their actual selves stripped of the protective coloration that had sustained them throughout the investigation. "I believe," Alleyn announced as the clock struck 9, "that we have learned as much as we can from this evening's performance. The acoustics have proved most instructive, as has the interpretive approach to certain botanical references." His words carried gentle authority that suggested conclusions had been reached, though he maintained the careful courtesy that had marked his investigation throughout. When Miss Thornfield lingered near the performance area with that quality of hesitation which marked someone approaching a crucial decision, Alleyn understood that the moment for private revelation had arrived. Her small valise remained beside her chair like a prop awaiting its final cue, while her composure showed signs of strain that suggested the evening's discoveries had brought her to the edge of some internal precipice. The botanical evidence, the acoustic revelations, and the evening's theatrical discoveries had combined to create a picture of careful preparation and intimate knowledge that pointed inexorably toward a conclusion. Someone among Wintermere's elegant company had transformed amateur theatricals into genuine tragedy, using scientific expertise and household intimacy to orchestrate Mrs. Ashcroft's final performance with chilling precision. The Scarlet Invitation had indeed summoned its recipient to a carefully staged death, but the playwright responsible was about to discover that Inspector Alleyn had been studying the script with equal attention to detail. The final curtain was approaching, and with it the quiet revelation that would transform Wintermere's elegant surface into something far more complex and ultimately tragic than mere amateur dramatics could ever suggest. As the company began to disperse, each carrying their own burden of knowledge and anxiety, Alleyn prepared for the delicate task of extracting truth from someone who had demonstrated that beneath the veneer of quiet politeness and artistic sensitivity lay both the intellect and the ruthlessness necessary to commit murder with scientific precision and aesthetic sensibility. The drawing room emptied with the measured courtesy of actors departing a familiar stage, each member of the company carrying their own burden of the evening's accumulated revelations. Inspector Alleyn remained near the mantelpiece where firelight cast gentle shadows across the family photographs, his attention focused on Miss Thornfield, who lingered beside the Queen Anne chair with that quality of hesitation which marked someone approaching the edge of some internal precipice. Lady Constance paused at the threshold, her experienced eye reading the atmospheric shift that suggested private conversation was required. "Inspector, I shall be in my sitting room should you require anything further," she said, her voice carrying subtle acknowledgement that whatever truth emerged would be handled with the discretion that had governed Wintermere House for generations. The door closed with gentle finality, leaving only the whisper of flames and the distant ticking of the hall clock to mark the passage of moments that would prove crucial. Miss Thornfield moved to the window where evening light filtered through tall panes, transforming the familiar gardens into something approaching a stage set. Her reflection in the glass appeared ghostly, insubstantial, as if she were already beginning to fade from the solid world of Wintermere's elegant certainties. When she spoke, her voice carried that brittle quality of fine crystal under pressure, each word chosen with the precision of someone who understood that confession, like performance, required careful attention to timing and effect. "You know, don't you, Inspector?" The question emerged not as inquiry but as statement, delivered with the weary recognition of someone who had reached the end of a carefully maintained deception. The botanical evidence in the conservatory, the acoustic discoveries during this evening's rehearsal, they all point toward conclusions that can no longer be avoided through mere politeness. Alleyn approached the chair opposite hers with unhurried grace, understanding that truth extracted through patience proved more reliable than that obtained through pressure. His voice, when he spoke, carried the gentle authority that had marked his investigation, throughout, never demanding but always encouraging revelation through its very reasonableness. I know that someone with intimate knowledge of plant properties and household routines orchestrated Mrs. Ashcroft's death with remarkable sophistication, he said quietly. The digitalis required not merely casual familiarity with garden plants, but the precise botanical knowledge necessary to extract and concentrate cardiac glycosides into a form that could be administered through a familiar substance without detection. Miss Thornfield's hands, which had been clasped tightly in her lap, loosened almost imperceptibly as she began to speak with increasing fluency, as if the burden of secrecy had finally become too heavy to sustain alone. The previous Lady Windermere's journals contained extensive research into medicinal applications of common plants. Her work on digitalis purpurea was detailed with scientific precision, therapeutic doses, toxic levels, methods of concentration and administration through various vehicles. And Mrs. Ashcroft's morning tonic provided the perfect such vehicle? A shadow of what might have been regret crossed her features, though it was quickly replaced by something approaching clinical detachment. Vivienne complained constantly about the quinine's bitter taste, masking it with honey and lemon each morning at precisely 7:15. She believed it strengthened her constitution for theatrical performance, though she found the flavour barely tolerable even with sweetening. The revelation emerged with quiet intensity, each detail contributing to a picture of systematic preparation rather than impulsive action. Miss Thornfield described how she had spent weeks studying the botanical journals, learning not merely the identification of plants but their properties, their preparation, their effects upon human physiology when administered in carefully calculated doses. The timing required considerable precision, Alleyn observed. You needed her to reach the morning room before the poison took full effect, yet after it had progressed beyond any possibility of intervention. 30 to 45 minutes, based on the botanical references and her physical constitution, Miss Thornfield replied with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing a laboratory procedure. The Scarlet Invitation summoned her to what she believed would be a private discussion about the production's future, specifically about my replacement as Ophelia and my departure from Windermere House. The confession unfolded with devastating clarity as Miss Thornfield revealed the systematic exploitation of Mrs. Ashcroft's habits and the household's established routines. She'd observed how the morning room's acoustic properties allowed someone positioned in the conservatory to monitor conversations without detection. She had noted the precise timing of Mrs. Ashcroft's morning ritual, the woman's vanity about her supposed delicate constitution, her reliance on the bitter tonic that she consumed despite its unpleasant taste. Vivienne was destroying everything I had found here, Miss Thornfield continued, her voice carrying controlled intensity that spoke of accumulated resentment carefully channeled into lethal purpose. The security, the acceptance, the possibility of a future beyond mere survival, she wielded her financial contributions like weapons, demanding that Lady Constance choose between charitable necessity and personal loyalty. Alleyn noted how the justification emerged alongside the confession, revealing the psychological architecture that had transformed botanical curiosity into murderous application. When did you decide that Mrs. Ashcroft's threats required such permanent resolution? 3 nights ago, when she cornered me in the conservatory after the others had retired. She delivered her ultimatum with theatrical precision, speaking of my presence as reflecting poorly on Windermere's standards. Miss Thornfield's composure showed signs of genuine emotion for the first time. She was prepared to destroy Lady Constance's charitable work, to see dozens of children lose their support, simply to satisfy her own artistic vanity and social pretensions. The evening light had faded entirely, leaving the drawing room illuminated only by firelight and the gentle glow of table lamps. In this intimate atmosphere, the full architecture of the crime emerged with chilling clarity. Botanical expertise applied with scientific precision, household routines exploited with intimate knowledge, and Mrs. Ashcroft's personal habits transformed into instruments of her own destruction. The morning room staging, Alleyn continued, the overturned goblet, the deliberate placement of evidence, These were intended to suggest that she had prepared her own fatal drink rather than consumed poison elsewhere. Miss Thornfield nodded with quiet acknowledgement of her own careful planning. Vivienne appreciated dramatic gesture above all else. It seemed appropriate that her final performance should reflect the aesthetic sensibilities she claimed to value so highly. The morning room provided the perfect setting for such a carefully orchestrated conclusion. As the confession drew toward its completion, Alleyn understood that he was witnessing not merely the revelation of criminal method, but the psychological collapse of someone who had convinced herself that murder could serve noble purposes. The botanical knowledge, the acoustic discoveries, and the systematic exploitation of household intimacy had combined to create a crime of remarkable sophistication, executed by someone whose desperation had transformed scientific curiosity into lethal application. Lady Constance's kindness toward me was genuine, Miss Thornfield concluded, her voice carrying quiet conviction that spoke of careful rationalization during the weeks of preparation. She offered sanctuary when I had nowhere else to turn, treated me as family rather than charity case. Vivienne's threats represented not merely personal destruction, but the corruption of everything decent about this household. The silence that followed was broken only by the gentle whisper of flames and the distant sound of Mr. Swithin securing the house for the night, the familiar rituals of Windermere continuing even as its elegant surface had been forever altered by the revelation of what lay beneath. Miss Thornfield sat quietly in her chair, her small valise beside her like a prop awaiting its final cue, while her composure suggested not remorse, but the quiet acceptance of consequences she had always understood might follow her carefully calculated actions. "Miss Thornfield," Alleyn said gently, rising from his chair with characteristic courtesy, "I'm afraid I must ask you to remain available for further questioning tomorrow. The superintendent will require a formal statement, and Dr. Beecham's complete report will need to be reviewed." She looked up at him with eyes that held neither surprise nor protest, only the weary recognition of someone who had reached the end of a performance that had demanded more of her than she had ultimately been able to sustain. "I understand, Inspector. I suppose I always knew this moment would arrive, despite all my careful preparations." The drawing-room, having served as stage for both amateur theatricals and the revelation of genuine tragedy, settled back into its customary elegance, though the air still carried the weight of truths that could never be unspoken. The Scarlet Invitation had indeed summoned Mrs. Ashcroft to her final performance, but the playwright responsible had been someone whose quiet desperation and scientific precision had transformed botanical study into an instrument of calculated murder, proving that beneath Windermere's elegant surface lay depths as dangerous as they were unexpected. The morning light at Windermere House possessed that quality of careful neutrality which follows the revelation of truths too large for ordinary illumination to contain. Inspector Alleyn found Lady Constance in her private sitting-room, where the pale blue serenity had absorbed the weight of the previous evening's confessions, with the dignity that marked all her responses to domestic crisis, however extraordinary its nature. She sat at her escritoire with characteristic composure, though her hands showed the slight tremor of one who had spent the night confronting the collapse of assumptions she had taken for granted. The morning correspondence lay untouched before her, while her gaze moved repeatedly toward the conservatory doors where exotic blooms continued their silent testimony to knowledge that had been perverted into lethal application. "Inspector," she began, her voice carrying that controlled authority which had managed households and charitable committees through decades of smaller crises, "I find myself questioning every kindness I have shown, every sanctuary I have offered." Diana seemed so genuinely grateful, so dedicated to improving her circumstances through legitimate study. The admission emerged with the particular pain of one whose generosity had been exploited with systematic calculation. The machinery of justice. Dr. Beecham's arrival brought the final medical confirmation necessary for formal proceedings, his weathered features carrying the weight of professional testimony that would transform private confession into public record. The digitalis concentration was calculated with remarkable precision, he reported, settling into his chair with the deliberate movements of age tempered by long experience. The extraction and refinement required intimate knowledge of botanical chemistry that extends far beyond casual gardening, someone who understood not merely plant identification, but the precise methods of concentration and the timing of physiological effects. Superintendent Blackwood from the County Constabulary conducted the formal charging with that discretion appropriate to houses of Wintermere's calibre, his professional competence tempered by social awareness that preserved dignity while ensuring proper procedure. Miss Thornfield met the charges with quiet acceptance that spoke of psychological preparation, extending back to the moment she had first decided that Mrs. Ashcroft's threats required permanent resolution. Her formal statement, delivered in the library's scholarly calm, possessed that chilling detachment which marked someone discussing scientific methodology rather than human destruction. "I believed it was necessary to prevent further harm," she said, her voice carrying the same brittle composure that had marked her confession. Mrs. Ashcroft's financial coercion would have destroyed Lady Constance's charitable work and left me once again without recourse. Her death was a regrettable but unavoidable consequence of her own actions. Secondary complications. The morning's revelations were complicated by Mr. Harrington's reluctant admission to his own interference with the investigation's natural course. Summoned to Lady Constance's sitting room, he entered with theatrical grace that could not entirely disguise the nervous energy beneath his cultivated exterior. "I had nothing to do with the poisoning," he began with characteristic amplitude, then moderated his tone under Alleyn's patient gaze. "But I did what one might call arranging. The morning room scene seemed so untidy, so unlike what Vivienne would have wanted for her final performance. The confession emerged with painful precision. The tampering with the plate-safe's sealed key to retrieve the matching goblet, the forged telegram attempting to remove Miss Thornfield before investigation could focus upon her, the exploitation of his theatrical props to create false evidence. "She had letters," he admitted finally, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Unkind. Correspondence about my professional reputation that she enjoyed wielding as leverage. I feared the investigation might reveal embarrassing details." Alleyn received these admissions with the calm authority that had marked his investigation throughout, understanding that Harrington's vanity and fear had led him to corrupt evidence while remaining ignorant of the true crime unfolding around him. "You will make a formal statement regarding the seal and the forged message," he said without relish. "The law takes a dim view of such interference, however well-intentioned. The quality of resolution." Miss Thornfield's departure from Wintermere House was managed with the same discretion that had characterised her residence there, though now serving different purposes entirely. She requested a final moment in the conservatory, where she moved to the bench containing the botanical journals with the measured steps of one completing a ritual of farewell. She did not touch the volumes that had provided her deadly education, but instead removed the single tuberose from its slender vase and laid it across the open page displaying her detailed study of digitalis purpurea. The gesture possessed that quality of symbolic completion which marked someone who understood that certain performances required appropriate closure, even when witnessed only by conscience and consequence. Lady Constance's management of the household's response demonstrated the social grace that had sustained Wintermere through generations of lesser crises. The Scarlet Invitations were quietly removed and destroyed, their perversion of hospitality's proper forms requiring elimination rather than preservation. The conservatory journals were returned to their locked cabinet, their dangerous knowledge secured against future misuse. The morning room was restored to its customary dignity, though something in its atmosphere would forever carry the memory of how social forms could be corrupted into instruments of calculated death. The irony of justice. The resolution that emerged possessed that quality of quiet inevitability, which marked Marsh's most sophisticated conclusions. Justice served not through dramatic confrontation, but through the patient application of civilized procedure to uncivilized acts. Miss Thornfield would face the consequences of her botanical expertise and systematic planning within the formal structure of legal proceedings, yet her motivation, the preservation of charitable work and her own precarious sanctuary, remained a complex undercurrent that defied simple moral categorization. Mr. Harrington's lesser crimes would be handled through appropriate channels, his theatrical vanity and social climbing having led him to obstruct justice while remaining ignorant of the true tragedy unfolding around him. His punishment would be professional rather than criminal, exclusion from the circles he had sought to impress, the collapse of pretensions he had worked years to maintain. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Wintermere's carefully maintained grounds, the household settled into routines that appeared unchanged, yet carried the permanent alteration that follows the revelation of hidden depths beneath elegant surfaces. Mr. Swithins directed the staff with his customary efficiency. Mr. Pembroke attended to correspondence with renewed appreciation for the complexity of human nature, and Lady Constance resumed her charitable work with the knowledge that generosity, however well-intentioned, could not always prevent the corruption of desperate souls. The amateur theatricals that had provided the initial gathering would not be resumed, their innocent purpose having been forever overshadowed by the genuine tragedy that had transformed make-believe into lethal reality. In their place remained only the hard-won understanding that beneath the most civilized environments, human nature retained its capacity for both remarkable sophistication and devastating moral failure. Closing reflection. Inspector Alleyn's final survey of Wintermere House revealed spaces that retained their customary beauty while carrying the invisible weight of truths that could never be unspoken. The conservatory bloomed with exotic flowers whose scientific properties would forever remind him of knowledge perverted into criminal application. The morning room maintained its elegant composure while harbouring the memory of how social forms could be corrupted into instruments of death. The library's scholarly calm preserved the echo of confessions delivered with chilling detachment by someone who had transformed botanical curiosity into systematic murder. The Scarlet Invitation had indeed summoned Mrs. Ashcroft to her final performance, but the playwright responsible had been someone whose quiet desperation and scientific precision had demonstrated that even the most refined environments could harbour the capacity for carefully calculated evil. The curtain had fallen not with theatrical flourish, but with the quiet acceptance of consequences that marked civilized society's response to the violation of its most fundamental assumptions. As Alleyn departed through Wintermere's gates, the house settled behind him into its eternal rhythm of seasons and routines, forever changed yet determined to preserve the social graces that distinguish civilization from chaos. The case was closed, justice had been served through proper channels, and life would continue with that measured dignity which marked houses where tradition understood that some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud, yet too important to forget entirely. The morning light would return tomorrow with its customary discretion, illuminating spaces where human nature had revealed both its capacity for sophisticated evil and its ability to maintain civilized forms even in the face of their most profound corruption. At Wintermere House the performance would continue, though the cast would forever remember that beneath the elegant surface of their world lay depths as beautiful and as treacherous as any exotic bloom in Lady Constance's carefully tended conservatory. A pale frost had settled upon the lawns of Wintermere House during the night, lending the morning an crystalline clarity that seemed to etch each detail of the estate into its own essential form. Inspector Alleyn stood for a moment beneath the portico, his breath visible in the sharp air, and observed how the house had already begun its quiet process of absorption and recovery, the way that places of genuine substance accommodate even the most profound disruptions to their established order. Lady Constance emerged from her private sitting room with that measured step which had carried her through 40 years of managing both routine domestic matters and extraordinary crises with equal composure. She wore a cloak of charcoal wool and carried in her gloved hands a single envelope bearing Miss Thornfield's careful script, the final communication from someone who had transformed botanical curiosity into sophisticated murder, yet had maintained the courtesy of proper farewell even in the face of inevitable consequence. The final arrangements. She wrote to the Children's Shelter Committee, Lady Constance said, her voice carrying the controlled authority that had sustained charitable endeavours through decades of smaller challenges, a formal relinquishment of any claim upon their resources, and a request that her botanical illustrations be donated to the County Medical College. Even in departure, she sought to ensure that knowledge might serve healing rather than harm. The letter represented Miss Thornfield's final attempt to impose order upon chaos she had created, to transform her perverted application of scientific knowledge back toward its proper therapeutic purposes. Dr. Beecham's complete report had documented the remarkable sophistication of her crime, the precise extraction and concentration of digitalis, the calculated timing of its administration, the exploitation of Mrs. Ashcroft's established routines. Yet it had also noted the clinical compassion with which death had been delivered, ensuring the victim's final moments carried peaceful repose rather than suffering. The conservatory will remain locked for the present, Lady Constance continued as they moved toward the entrance hall, where morning light filtered through tall windows with renewed clarity. Mr. Pembroke has secured the botanical journals in their cabinet, and I have asked the vicar to hold the key until such time as proper supervision can be arranged. Knowledge, it seems, requires not merely intelligence to comprehend, but wisdom to apply appropriately. The philosophical observation settled into the hall's dignified atmosphere with the weight of hard-won understanding. Alleyn noted how the household had already begun its process of careful adjustment, Mr. Swithin's, directing the staff with renewed appreciation for the complexity of human nature. The morning room restored to its customary function, though forever altered by the memory of Mrs. Ashcroft's final performance. The Scarlet Invitations quietly removed and replaced with simple correspondence that could not be perverted into instruments of calculated death. Departures and consequences. Mr. Harrington's exit from Wintermere had been managed with the same courtesy that had marked his residence, though his theatrical pretensions had been permanently deflated by the revelation of his interference with the investigation. His forged telegram and manipulation of evidence had demonstrated vanity rather than malice, yet the social consequences would prove more severe than formal prosecution. Exclusion from the circles he had sought to impress, the collapse of pretensions he had cultivated for decades. "The amateur theatricals will not resume," Lady Constance observed as they paused beside the window overlooking the gardens, where frost had transformed familiar plantings into something approaching art. Shakespeare's tragedies seem rather pale beside the genuine article, and I find myself with little appetite for make-believe after witnessing the real machinery of human destruction and the sophisticated evil that can lurk beneath the most refined surfaces. Miss Thornfield's departure had been conducted with the same quiet dignity that had marked her residence at Wintermere, though serving different purposes entirely. She had requested a final moment in the conservatory, where she placed a single white tuberose across the open page displaying her detailed study of Digitalis Purpurea, a gesture of symbolic completion that acknowledged both the corruption of knowledge and the persistent beauty of the natural world from which that knowledge had been extracted. Alleyn's final reflections. As Alleyn prepared to depart through Wintermere's gates, he reflected on the case's particular sophistication and moral complexity. Miss Thornfield had demonstrated that beneath the most civilized environments, human nature retained its capacity for both remarkable intellectual achievement and devastating moral failure, often intertwined in ways that defied simple categorization. Her crime had been conceived not merely as murder, but as a form of scientific artistry, using the household's own routines and Mrs. Ashcroft's personal habits as instruments in a symphony of calculated death. "Inspector," Lady Constance said, extending her hand with the formal courtesy that had governed their interactions throughout the investigation, "I hope you will remember that Wintermere has been, for the most part, a house of genuine sanctuary." Miss Thornfield's actions, however sophisticated in their execution, arose from desperation rather than an inherent evil, the desperate act of someone who believed that murder could serve noble purposes. "I shall remember it as a place where generosity encountered desperation," Alleyn replied, accepting her farewell with gentle authority, "and where the collision produced consequences that demonstrated both the power and the peril of knowledge divorced from moral restraint. The dose, as you observed, determines whether wisdom heals or destroys." The symbolic conclusion. The motor car traced familiar lanes where frost had transformed hedgerows into crystalline sculptures that caught the morning light with temporary beauty. As Wintermere House disappeared behind a line of bare trees, Alleyn understood that he was leaving behind a household forever altered, yet committed to preserving the civilized forms that had been corrupted, but not destroyed by the revelation of what could lie beneath elegant surfaces. In his portfolio rested the formal documentation that would satisfy legal requirements, while preserving the discretion appropriate to houses of Wintermere's calibre. The case would be recorded with appropriate restraint, justice served through proper channels, and life resumed with that dignified persistence which marked places where tradition understood that some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud yet too important to forget entirely. The conservatory's exotic blooms would continue their silent cycles, though their botanical properties would forever carry the memory of knowledge perverted into lethal application. The morning room would resume its customary functions, though its atmosphere would always harbour the ghost of Mrs. Ashcroft's final, unwilling performance. The Scarlet Invitation had indeed summoned its recipient to death, but the playwright responsible had discovered that in the theatre of murder, even the most carefully orchestrated productions remained subject to the ultimate judgment of both human conscience and divine justice. As the first signals of the railway cutting appeared through morning mist, Alleyn drew on his gloves and prepared for the return to London, carrying with him the melancholy understanding that civilization itself was a question of precise measurement. Too little, and life became brutish; too much, and the breath was pressed from it entirely. Somewhere between the beauty of exotic blooms and the corruption of their scientific properties lay the delicate art of living decently, more challenging than any theatrical performance, and subject to an audience far less forgiving than any drawing-room could contain. The case was closed, but its implications would linger in the careful spaces between knowledge and wisdom, between generosity and exploitation, between the preservation of order and the recognition that beneath the most refined surfaces, human nature retained its eternal capacity for both remarkable sophistication and devastating moral failure. At Windermere House the performance would continue, though the cast would forever remember that some roles, once assumed, could never be entirely abandoned, and that the Scarlet Invitation to civilization itself required constant vigilance to prevent its corruption into something far more sinister than mere social theatre could ever suggest.